Another story that came out this week that you were tweeting about, and I think obviously anybody that knows anything about you and follows you on Twitter, Alan, knows that this is something that's really important to you. Former Canadian star Ralph Backstrom, 17-year NHL career, over 600 points, and another 280, I believe, in the WHA as well. So pretty prolific career.
Yep.
He had CTE. This is a Montreal Canadiens star who unfortunately sometimes gets forgotten about with some of the names that they had thrown around, but he was a major player on these teams.
Yeah.
And he had CTE, and it's obviously something that you're very passionate about. The NHL stance on it, though, really bothers you.
Yeah. I mean, Gary Bettman has said repeatedly that the science is not at the point where you can make an association between repetitive blows to the head and CTE. And that's just not true. The NFL, the CDC, the US military, and a whole host of other organizations have acknowledged the link. And the link is not concussions per se.
Mm-hmm.
And that sometimes gets lost in, there was a movie, Concussion, and there was a book that was very well known by the same name. But it really has to do with subconcussive blows to the head, repetitive subconcussive blows. In any typical NHL game, in any typical NHL season, players are being jolted, players are being body checked, and their brains are banging against the inside of their skull when that happens, not rising to the level of a concussion.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes we look at players and we say, well, he had 12 concussions in his career. That's a lot, right?
Yeah.
15 concussions in their career. That's a lot. But really what the science is lending itself to right now is that it's not necessarily how many concussions you've had, but how many blows to the head, how many jolts and jarring motions against boards and with other players, repetitive, subconcussive. And if you start adding that up over a player's career, we get thousands of impacts, thousands. So where is the science today that Gary denies? 315 plus former NFL players have been found to have CTE. And 13 out of 14 NHL players have been found to have CTE. So in the NHL, we're at about 98%. How do we find CTE in a situation? All of these people have donated their brains to organizations like the Concussion Legacy Foundation at Boston University. On the medical side, one of the foremost CTE experts in the world is Dr. Ann McKee. And they receive a brain and they dissect a brain of somebody who's passed away, obviously. And they're able now to determine between 4 levels of severity how much CTE exists in the brain. And Ralph Backstrom was type 3, which is severe. So he had a severe case of CTE. We are not at the point yet medically where there is a diagnostic test for anybody to determine whether they have CTE existing in their brain right now. But we are getting to the point, maybe within the next 5 years, where there will be such a diagnostic test. And that's the whole purpose of the research. The research has several goals to it. Number one, determine who has CTE and what the cause of it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then be able to develop a diagnostic tool to let us know how we can determine who has CTE in the living,
mm-hmm.
and then ultimately come up with prevention and treatment for CTE for people who are living. So it's that whole process. The first part of that process is for Gary Bettman, and it rests with him to acknowledge that there absolutely is an association between these repetitive blows to the head and CTE. What is CTE? Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a degenerative brain disease, very similar to Alzheimer's, where people suffering from it have memory issues, anger, depression. Ultimately, slowly over time, these people lose their minds. Their brains are degenerating to nothing. And it's a horrible fate that awaits many players who played the game from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And right now, the NHL is not participating in any research. So Gary Bettman is saying we need more research. There's no medical certainty out there right now, which is a euphemism he uses. There's no medical certainty that there's an association between hockey and CTE. That would be ignoring the 13 out of 14 cases that exist right now and ignoring the 315 cases of CTE found in the NFL. We'd be ignoring the NFL clearly stating the association between blows to the head, playing football, and CTE. The U.S. military, according to Gary Bettman, is wrong. The CDC is wrong, but he's right. Oh, and only him, because literally he's the last man standing on this absurd position that he's chosen to stick with in the face of all the new studies and all the mounting evidence scientifically, medically that exists out there. And it's something that is very near and dear to me. Mm-hmm. You know, Gary Bettman says that the NHL is a quote unquote open book, and that it's an NHL family, and the family and all the implications of being part of the NHL family. Well, more and more we are hearing stories over the years of players who had long careers. Ralph Backstrom was not an enforcer. He was not a fighter. He was a skilled hockey player, which makes this finding so unique. And I think it's critical for people to understand what CTE is, where it comes from, how you can acquire it, and then commit to research. More NHL players committing now to donating their brains when they move on, when they pass on, so that there can be more studies and more research, all geared towards one thing: prevention and treatment. And the beginning of all that begins with Gary Bettman admitting what we all know to be true, what Chris Nowinski, the founder and head of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, says is an absurd position to take. So it's time. The time is now. The time was really several years ago. Mm-hmm. Ken Dryden wrote his incredible book, Game Change, about the life and times of Steve Monador. And Ken Dryden said at the time, I wrote this book for an audience of one. He wrote the book specifically to Gary Bettman. He was talking to one person, his audience of one. And he met with Gary. He presented Gary with the book, and hasn't heard from him since. Oh. So this is something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be spoken about, and I'm happy to have an audience and a forum to be able to do that right now.